So you might already be noticing a pattern that began in the lecture on the Constitution and is continuing into this lecture on civil liberties, which is that there are seemingly clear cut descriptions of the liberties that people enjoy in this country, yet we have systematically interpreted those liberties in such a way that certain things can be prohibited, but other things cannot. Let's move on from the First Amendment and go to the Second Amendment. Again, pretty straightforward, a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is often used by gun rights activists to assure the public that there should be no restrictions, or at least very few restrictions, on gun ownership. It is, after all, a right listed in the Constitution. Gun control advocates, however, will point to this very same amendment and say, what are you talking about? The words well regulated are right there in the amendment. Yet it is almost universally accepted that background checks are to be allowed. Every state has some sort of background check law, and it is a part of federal law. And as a matter of fact, the Second Amendment was not interpreted to grant a right to private, personal gun ownership until the Supreme Court ruled in such a way in 2001. We allow certain buildings to prohibit firearms on the premises. For example, Rice University has a weapons policy that prohibits not only firearms, but all sorts of weapons. And yet, even though we don't enjoy the extension of certain liberties that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution, there does exist, according to the Supreme Court, a right or liberty to privacy. You can already see the terminology is starting to get a bit hazy in terms of liberties and rights. That is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court has ruled that a right to privacy implicitly exists. It was first articulated in a Supreme Court case, Griswold v. Connecticut, in which the Supreme Court ruled that a law banning contraception was unconstitutional. And the reason why they ruled that way was because the Constitution did not allow for state intrusion into such personal decisions, because people had a right to some sort of private conduct. And despite the fact that this language exists nowhere in the Constitution, they ruled that because the Third Amendment prohibits being forced to quarter soldiers, because the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure, and so on and so forth, that other amendments in the Constitution sort of had this implicit acceptance that American citizens had this expectation that they were entitled to a private life, a private sphere of being. And that's where this right to privacy came from. Even then, there is some debate over the extent to a right to privacy. What exactly is meant by a right to privacy? Freedom from government intrusion in one's home is one explanation. Do we want to guarantee that the government won't watch us? Or do we simply not want the government to use such surveillance against us? So, for example, the government could be watching us all the time, but as long as they don't try to use that information against citizens, well, maybe that's not so bad. Do we want freedom from government intrusion regarding one's body, such as sexual privacy? I told you Griswold v. Connecticut had to do with contraception. The right to privacy was also the basis for Roe v. Wade and the right to get an abortion. It has often been used to justify ruling as unconstitutional laws that regulated sexual behavior, such as same-sex relationships. So let's talk a little bit more in depth on this surveillance issue. So we say often that we want protection from surveillance. Well, what gets me about this, or what is very contradictory about this idea, is the extent to which we willingly tell people, tell the government, tell institutions exactly where we are and what we're doing. Red light cameras, for example, are easy ways for the government to see where we've been driving. If you use toll roads frequently, you might have an easy pass or some equivalent to it. That's an easy way for information to be downloaded to, again, see where we're driving. If you use a credit card, a record of all the stores you've been to that you've used it for uh, is also easily obtainable by government entities. And so many of us, so willingly and loudly, put our information, location, personal beliefs, as well as even photos and videos of ourselves willingly onto social media platforms. Again, this is stuff we just put out there. A lot of people resent the fact that in some instances, uh, government employers have used materials that we as individuals posted onto our social media accounts, saying that it's an invasion of privacy. But it's difficult to make the case that these are private materials when you've willingly put it on the internet for public consumption. And so, one of the things that the original theorists on privacy law might not have anticipated is that the government might not need to necessarily intrude on our lives because we put so much of it out there already. Can liberties be restricted? Well, I've already noted to you multiple times instances in which they can be restricted, or at least have been restricted. You might be familiar with this quote: "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." It's often used to argue against restrictions on liberties for the sake of national security, or for the sake of limiting some sort of negative effects of a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. Well, first off, this quote is often taken out of context. It actually comes from before the revolution, in which Benjamin Franklin was very concerned about the Pennsylvania state legislature's attempts to tax the Penn family, which were the proprietary family of the state of Pennsylvania, and attempting to rule it from afar. The state legislature, you see, was attempting to tax family lands in order to pay for its efforts in the French and Indian War. The Penn family was instructing the governor to veto. Instead, the Penn family wanted to simply give a lump sum to the state of Pennsylvania because they felt that endorsing the ability of the legislature to tax Penn family lands would set a bad precedent. You see, when Benjamin Franklin stated that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety, he literally meant purchase a little temporary safety. And so it wasn't exactly this general condemnation of those that would submit to government regulations or limitations for the sake of safety. But still, let's assume that there is this concern of balancing security and liberty. Well, as much as we would like to say, or as many of us would like to say, that that balance is easy to find, or it's obvious where the line is, it's not so easy in practice. We often restrict liberties during war. So, for example, the right to habeas corpus, which is the right to have evidence presented in a case against you should you be accused of crime, was suspended by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Censorship was rampant during World War I under President Wilson. They prohibited anti war propaganda from being distributed. And famously, the Supreme Court ruled during World War I that pamphlets being distributed that discouraged people from signing up for the draft was prohibited, and that such actions were ruled by the Supreme Court to be constitutional. Infamously, during World War II, Japanese and German American citizens were placed into internment camps. So their ability to move freely and to live freely was restricted solely based on their race and national origin. As I stated before, we also do this in the name of national security. So George W. Bush greatly expanded the surveillance state in response to the so-called War on Terror after the September 11th attacks. And Barack Obama, infamously, again, cracked down on journalists and their ability to seek information from the government in the name of state secrecy. And so, as you can see, all of these presidents were from different political parties. So presidents of both major parties have shown a willingness to restrict liberties if it meant securing some sort of greater purpose, such as national security or a war effort. We face another crisis right now, the global pandemic. There has been a concern about the effects that COVID-19 is going to have on civil liberties in this country. We've seen many protests to that effect. People's ability to gather and assemble without having to observe social distancing practices. That is something that has proven very difficult to enforce, despite the fact that there have been rules instituted to that effect. They've largely been fairly lax in terms of enforcement. Here in Harris County, where I am, for a while, there were mask ordinances put in place that did have consequences of jail time or even a fine. However, the state government intervened, saying that mask wearing should be encouraged, but optional. And that has caused some concern, right? Because masks are said to be, by some, only optimally effective if everyone is wearing them. If you make them optional, then it decreases the effectiveness, and some would argue to the point where it defeats the purpose. Still, police unions were amongst the first to criticize the ordinance because of this concern that over-policing might cause more damage to the effort against COVID-19 than lax enforcement of mask wearing. One way that has been proposed to contain the virus without a vaccine is through a contact tracing app that everybody could download an app that would track your movements and everyone that you've ever come in contact with. That way, if you are found to be positive for the virus, they can track down every place you've been and every person you've come into contact with and warn them that they should self-quarantine. This has also caused some concerns for liberty advocates that this technology could be used to track movements. Others would argue by pointing out what I mentioned to you before. Credit cards, red light cameras, easy passes, surveillance cameras already do some form of that. And so there's very little difference or harm to liberty if you implement a contact tracing app.